supply curve. Well, why do I have that? Well, because it ties in really neatly to the Phillips curve. You can see right here, we've got aggregate supply. Okay? Well, guess what? To get the Phillips curve, you just create a mirror image of that. There's your Phillips curve. Okay, we're going to label that. This is the short run aggregate supply curve. We're going to label this the short run Phillips curve. Okay, we've got the long run aggregate supply right here. And we're going to label this the long run Phillips curve. Well, what's the Phillips curve even talk about? Well, it talks about the relationship of inflation to unemployment. Well, we have that over here on an aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. First of all, excuse me, what is price level? Well, price level is a proxy for inflation. So here, the y-axis is actually inflation, because over here on aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we're talking about dollars, and we can move on from year to year to year. Well, with the Phillips curve, we can't do that. The Phillips curve, we're just talking about a point in time. So rather than price level, we're going to talk about inflation. So instead of price level being 157 or something like that, inflation could be 2%, it could be 8% or 10%. Instead of GDP, and over here, which is a dollar amount, right? GDP is a dollar amount, but we have full employment here. Well, this is in fact full employment. And we've talked about a proxy for full employment being about 5%. Well, this is unemployment. So the graph on the Phillips curve actually is unemployment, whereas the graph over here on ADAS is a proxy for unemployment. We know this is right. This is about 5%. And as you go back this way, it gets to, you have a recession. It gets to be 8%, 10%, and so on. You know, maybe there's 8, maybe there's 10. Over here, maybe it's only about 3%. Well, it's inverted over here. Here's our 5%. As we go farther to the right, unemployment gets smaller. It gets larger. So this is 8% and 10%. And as we go left, unemployment gets smaller. So let's say right here might be 3%. But inflation starts to go up. In other words, if the economy is doing better, we're going to have a higher inflation. Over here, with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, same situation. As the economy gets better, we have inflation. We call that demand pull inflation. Well, demand pull inflation is going to be over on this side of the Phillips curve. Now, where are we right this second? Well, if you look at the aggregate demand supply curve, we're right here at long run equilibrium. That's right here at long run equilibrium. What happens? How would we illustrate demand pull inflation? Well, we look over here at the aggregate demand and supply curves. We shift aggregate demand. Aha! Right here, demand pull inflation. That same point, remember this is to the right. This is a mirror image over this line right here. So it's going to be to the left. We put that point right there. We have lower unemployment and we have higher inflation than we initially had, right? There's our equilibrium. There's our new equilibrium. Inflation's gone up. Unemployment's gone down. Over here in the ADAS, we've increased output. That would lower unemployment, right? In this case, say to that 3% or whatever. And inflation would increase. Let's say originally right here it was 2%. Maybe now it's 5%. Okay? So you can see these things tie directly together. Anything that you can do over here on aggregate supply, you can do something similar on the Phillips curve. They're mirror images of each other, and they talk about the same things. Over on aggregate demand, aggregate supply, although it's a dollar measure, we can also address employment or unemployment over here, which we do directly on the Phillips curve. And we talk about price level with GDP. We talk about actual inflation on the Phillips curve. Next thing we're going to talk about is what would cause the Phillips curve to shift. Well, there's three primary things that are going to cause the Phillips curve to shift, and guess what they are? Well, they're right here. These are the determinants of short-run aggregate supply. Input prices. Input prices go down. What happens to our situation here? And I've left off the aggregate demand curve just to keep from cluttering it up. Well, input prices go down. We have an increase in aggregate supply. Businesses are helped. They supply more. Well, we set a mirror image, remember? Remember that mirror image? So if this side shifts to the right, then the Phillips curve is going to shift to the left. When the Phillips curve shifts to the left, what happens at any point in time, on the curve to inflation? And you can see it's lower, right? That every single point inflation is lower because we're more productive. If we had improved productivity due to more technology, we'd end up with that same situation. Same thing on the Phillips curve. If we have fewer government regulations, then businesses would have lower cost, they would supply more, and same thing over here, the Phillips curve would shift left. All of those lower inflation. And of course, vice versa too. If any of these input, productivity/technology, or government regulations hurt businesses, well, they're going to have a shift to the left of aggregate supply. Well, if we shift aggregate supply to the left, then our mirror image over here is going to shift to the right. And what do you see? Well, right here at full employment, you're going to have higher inflation, right? Let's say you were here, and now you've gone up to here. So we have same situation where both places we're at full employment, but we have higher inflation now because we've hurt businesses. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's move on. Here we're going to show long-run aggregate supply. Well, we're going to talk about long-run aggregate supply and the long-run Phillips curve. Okay, now we remember long-run aggregate supply. Well, remember this guy? What's that called? That's right, that's a production possibilities curve. How do we grow it? Well, improved technology, increased investment, things like that. Things that help businesses in the long term, right? Well, anything that grows this also causes long-run aggregate supply to increase. Okay? Now, the thing is, see that Y sub F? Well, now this becomes Y sub F. So we've actually changed the Y sub F. This is still 5%. This one was 5%. This one's also 5%. But it's more dollars, right? GDP real, it's more dollars. Well, over here, here's 5%. Well, remember it's over here, it's 5%. Long-run aggregate supply, unemployment is still 5%. Well, 5%'s right here. There's no dollars over here, right? There's no dollars over here. So the long-run Phillips curve does not shift with growth in the long-run aggregate supply. The short-run Phillips curve shifts. The long-run Phillips curve does not shift. Well, then you ask, okay, well then does it ever shift, or did I just draw it once and I'm good? There's only one primary thing that will shift the long-run Phillips curve. Remember, unemployment's 5%. Well, assuming you have full employment, what would change that 5%, let's say, to 8 or 9%? Well, we actually already have an answer within the world economy, and it's most of Europe. Europe has very generous unemployment policies. Guess what their full employment rate is? Do you think it's 5%, or do you think very generous policies would cause more people to be willing to be unemployed? And the answer is generous policies create more unemployment. Europe's full unemployment rate is higher than the United States because, frankly, it's just easier to be unemployed and still survive. In the United States, you pretty much need to find a job eventually. In Europe, you're a little less likely you're able to get more. So if we said the government changed the unemployment compensation right now, the general rule is you can get it for about 6 months. Let's say they said, you know what, we're going to pay you unemployment compensation for 3 years. Well, more people would be unemployed. So this 5%, let's say it becomes 7%. And that's going to shift to the right. And we'll have higher rates of unemployment, right? Here's 0. Here's 5 right there. Now here's 7. It keeps going up. Now, in all likelihood, this is also going to shift the short-run Phillips curve, but we're just dressing the long run right here. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense.